The dining room of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant was built for silence, the kind of silence that weighed more than sound itself. That night, it fell like a curtain. Forks froze in midair, conversations choked off, and dozens of curious eyes locked onto a fragile scene unfolding between tables draped in white linen. A young boy, no older than 10, trembled as he stood on shaky legs braced in steel. Every step he took screeched like metal against marble. In his outstretched hand, he held not confidence, but desperation and invitation that seemed impossible for him to give. At his side stood a waitress, the only black woman in the room. For 5 years, she had learned to become invisible to wealthy patrons who never bothered to remember her name. But in this frozen moment, every gaze pierced her, waiting for her decision. Would she retreat like she always had, quietly fading into the background? Or would she step forward into a storm she knew could cost her everything? Around her, whispers stirred. A manager's voice cut the air like a knife. A billionaire father shifted uncomfortably, torn between control and the memory of a wife now gone. The boy's trembling hand didn't move. Neither did hers. Until slowly, deliberately she chose. And with that single choice, lives that had been carved apart by privilege, pain, and prejudice began to collide. Because sometimes the smallest step isn't just a dance, it's a revolution. Before we continue, make sure you hit that subscribe button to join us here at Hidden Black Stories, where we uncover powerful, untold narratives that challenge prejudice and reveal the strength of the human spirit. Now, let's return to the story. The world of Richard Montgomery was built on glass towers, unshakable wealth, and silence. Silenced in the boardrooms where his word was law. Silence in the corridors of power where his signature shifted markets. And silence at home where his only son, Lucas, lived under the shadow of both privilege and tragedy. 2 years earlier, an accident had changed everything. Once a lively, athletic child, Lucas now depended on heavy metal braces strapped to his legs, reminders of both survival and limitation. The Montgomery name could purchase the finest specialists, the most advanced treatments, and round-the-clock care. But Mooney had not bought back his son's smile. Richard had learned to measure success in acquisitions and deals, not in fragile human connections. He had buried himself in his empire, convinced that control could shield him from pain. But when Lucas asked to dine out in public for the first time since the accident, Richard reluctantly agreed. That night, they walked into Kingsley's, a fortress of exclusivity in Manhattan, where the wealthy dined on perfection and the staff operated like unseen machinery. Among that staff was Diana Johnson. To most, she was invisible, waitress, a shadow passing between tables. But invisibility was a skill she had honed, not a flaw. As the only black employee in a place where stats gleamed from every corner, she had learned to move with caution, to avoid drawing attention, to avoid reminding certain guests of her presence. Diana had dreams. Once, she carried with her an unfinished master's degree in special education. Nights spent tutoring children in cramped apartments and a community program she had tried to keep alive against impossible odds. But bills demanded sacrifice, and life pushed her into survival mode. The polished world of Kingsley's was not her stage. It was her battlefield! That evening, the battlefield shifted. As the soft notes of the piano filled the air, Lucas's body moved before his mind could catch up. With a courage born from longing, he extended his small, trembling hand toward Diana. For him, it was not a performance, not an act of rebellion. It was the simple, human desire to connect to dance. The silence that followed his gesture was suffocating. For the wealthy patrons, it was entertainment. For the staff, it was a breach of order. For Manager Thornton, it was scandal. And for Richard Montgomery, it was disastrous spotlight on his son's weakness in a world where weakness was forbidden. Thornton's voice cut through the stillness. Sharp, dismissive, laced with authority. Employees were not there to entertain, he said. This was not a dance hall. The boy must sit down. But Lucas's hand lingered, suspended between rejection and hope. His legs quivered, His braces screeched, and his eyes pleaded silently. Diana stood frozen. She knew the weight of every eye in the room pressing against her skin, the unspoken rule that her position, her race, and her silence kept her employed. But within the boy's fragile hand, she saw more than a request. She saw a mirror of the children she had once fought for, their longing to be seen, not pitied, their need to lead, not be controlled. She reached for her apron, untied it slowly, and placed it on the tray. My shift is over, she declared, not with words for the room, but with an action that could not be ignored. Then she did the unthinkable. She took Lucas's hand. Gasps rippled through the dining hall like a wave. The child took a clumsy, dragging step, and Diana matched her pace to his, refusing to guide, refusing to correct. For the first time since the accident, Lucas wasn't being led. He was leading. Whispers rose. She'll be fired tomorrow. How dare she defy the rules? What is that man going to do? Richard sat paralyzed, 1,000 calculations spinning in his mind. He could end Diana's career with a single word. He could erase her existence from this polished world as easily as he signed off on a contract. But something stopped him, the sight of his son. In Lucas's eyes, fear was replaced by concentration. Shame transformed into shy pride. And in the rhythm of those 3 halting dance steps, Richard saw ghost his late wife, Elizabeth, twirling their son in the living room, whispering words he had long forgotten. It's not about perfection. It's about connection. When Diana finally returned Lucas to the table, she addressed him with dignity, thanking him for the honor of the dance. It was the kind of respect no amount of money could purchase, but every child deserved. And in that moment, Richard Montgomery's carefully constructed silence began to crack. Because what had just unfolded was not a mistake to be erased. It was the beginning of a revolution that would challenge everything he thought he knew about power, dignity, and what it truly meant to lead. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the polished marble floors of Montgomery Tower, a skyscraper that stood as both fortress and monument to its owner's power. Few entered its walls without invitation, and fewer still without privilege. Yet Diana Johnson found herself walking across its lobby, clutching a worn purse and wearing her best outfit in navy skirts and a white blouse bought secondhand. The receptionist looked at her as though she had wandered in by mistake. A black woman in a building like this raised eyebrows even before she announced her name. But after a clipped phone call, she was directed upstairs. Her presence causing subtle glances from passing employees who could not imagine what role she might serve. She had been summoned by Richard Montgomery himself. And though she felt the weight of what that meant, her stride carried not fear but determination. Diana had faced harsher judgments than the quiet stares of corporate America. Waiting for her was Margaret Winters, Montgomery's chief Ada woman who had perfected the art of icy politeness. As they walked the mirrored corridors together, Winters broke the silence with a cutting remark. It wasn't unusual, she explained, for wealthy clients to demand the firing of staff who didn't know their place. It had happened before, and it would happen again. Diana did not flinch. And where exactly is that place? She asked softly. Winters had no answer. When she entered Richard's office, the view of Manhattan spread behind him like an empire at his feet. He turned slowly, controlled as ever, his expression unreadable. Yet Diana noticed the hesitation in his eyes. Something had unsettled him. Their exchange began with questions meant to test her, as though her identity could be reduced to degrees, resumes, and neatly catalogued accomplishments. To his surprise, Diana revealed a background that went far deeper than her role as a waitress. A bachelor's degree in child development. Graduate studies in special education left incomplete only because life had demanded sacrifice. And most importantly, a project she had co-founded years ago, Freedom Steps, a community program using adaptive dance for children with physical disabilities. Richard, who had prided himself on knowing everything, already held a file filled with details about her work. He had researched her overnight, compelled by the image of his son smiling for the first time in years. He had discovered that Freedom Steps was on the brink of collapse, suffocated by lack of funding and ignored by donors like himself. What stunned him most was her refusal to ask for anything. She had not come seeking money, connections, or favors. She had only come because he had summoned her, and so Richard made his offer. Not as a benefactor, but as a father, grasping for something he could not control. He wanted Diana to work for him not as a waitress, but as a therapeutic companion for Lucas. He promised her a salary 5 times what she earned now, resources beyond imagination, security she had never known. But Diana said no. It wasn't anger that fueled her refusal, nor arrogance. It was conviction. She would not be bought by wealth that saw only her color, her class, and her utility. She would not sell the dignity of her mission, or reduce herself to a tool for a man who wanted to purchase connection rather than live it. For Richard, the rejection was unthinkable. He had built an empire on the belief that everything had a price. Yet here stood a woman who saw through him, who told him plainly that his son did not need more experts, but space to lead his own life. Before she left, Diana placed a simple card on his desk. On it were the words Freedom Steps, along with the address of a community center in the Bronx. Tuesdays and Thursdays, 4 o'clock, if you'd like to bring Lucas. The first class is free. Then she walked away, her calm determination contrasting with the storm brewing inside the billionaire's chest. 4 days. Richard wrestled with her defiance. He could dismiss her, bury her program, and move on. But every time he tried to resume his empire of silence, the memory returned to Lucas, smiling. Lucas! Leading! Lucas! Alive! The turning point came one Wednesday afternoon, when a sleek Bentley rolled to a hesitant stop outside the worn doors of the community warehouse. Inside, Diana was preparing the studio, unaware that a man who had rejected her proposals 3 times was now sitting in the driver's seat. Debating whether to cross the invisible boundary between his world of privilege and hers of resilience, Lucas stepped out first, adjusting his braces, eyes wide with both hope and fear. Richard followed, awkward in casual clothes that still screamed wealth, his posture betraying the discomfort of a man out of place. For the first time in his life, Richard Montgomery was not in control. He was on someone else's ground, and the step he was about to take would decide whether his fortress of glass remained intact, or shattered under the weight of a truth he had spent years ignoring. Because what awaited him inside was not just a dance class, it was a revolution, disguised as rhythm, where children with braces, wheels, and prosthetics moved freely, rewriting the definition of strength. And at the center of it stood Diana Johnson, no longer invisible, but a leader daring to show him that dignity could not be bought, only lived. The warehouse air pulsed with the echo of drums, their rhythm steady yet alive. Inside, the children of Freedom Steps formed a circle, their braces, wheelchairs, and prosthetic limbs moving to a beat that ignored limitation. Their laughter filled the space, unpolished yet powerful. For them, the studio was sanctuary. When Lucas entered, all movement stopped. The children turned, curious. He was the boy from the magazines, the heir whose life had been defined by wealth and whispers, rarely seen without the careful shadow of his father. But here, in a room stripped of chandeliers and marble, his braces clicked against the wooden floor. A sound that carried vulnerability rather than prestige. Richard followed, stiff and uneasy, scanning the cracked walls and faded mirrors. Everything about the space contradicted the empire he built. No polish, no prestige. Only purpose. And at its center Diana. Her voice rose above the silence, calm but commanding, as she invited Lucas into the circle. The boy hesitated, looking to his father for approval. Richard's instinct was to step forward, to control, to protect. But Diana's gaze cut him still. This was not his stage! This was Lucas's. The music swelled, and with trembling hands, Lucas extended his arm to a girl in a wheelchair. She grinned, clasped his hand, and spun herself forward as Lucas shuffled to match her movement. The circle erupted in cheers, the rhythm intensifying as children found strength not in perfection, but in persistence. For the first time, Richard saw his son, not as fragile, but as fierce. Each brace-supported step was a defiance of the silence that had consumed their home. And then it happened. Lucas stumbled, nearly falling, but instead of retreating, he laughed. He laughed so loudly that it echoed off the warehouse walls, a sound Richard had not heard since his wife was alive. But outside, Unseen by those within, a different rhythm was building. Cameras clicked. A line of black cars had pulled up to the curb. Word had spread of Billionaire's presence in a forgotten Bronx community center was news. Reporters swarmed, their voices sharp with questions, their lenses aimed not at the children, but at the man who could not escape them. When Richard finally stepped outside, he was blinded by flashes. "Mr. Montgomery, what brings you here? Is this philanthropy or PR? Are you funding this program?" The questions collided, hungry for scandal. For years, Richard had controlled every narrative about himself. Now, he stood in the open, stripped of his fortress. Then came the cutting one. "Do you believe your son should be associated with this place?" The word this hung heavy, dripping with disdain. In that single syllable lay the implication of race, class perversion, attempt to reduce the dignity of what he had just witnessed inside. Richard's throat tightened. For decades, he had navigated the world with calculated silence. But now, with Lucas's laughter still ringing in his ears, silence felt like betrayal. He glanced back through the doorway, where Diana stood with the children, unflinching under the gaze of strangers who had never bothered to see her. Her eyes did not plead, nor accuse. They simply asked whether he would finally stand for something greater than himself. Richard raised his voice, steady yet uncharacteristically raw. "What I saw in there," he said, "was strength. Courage! Leadership! Things money can't buy." The crowd pressed closer. "Are you donating, then?" Richard shook his head. "This isn't about writing a check. It's about showing up. About learning from people who've been invisible too long. Including my own son." A murmur rippled through the reporters. This was not the polished billionaire they expected. It was a man unraveling, confronting not just a question of wealth, but of humanity. One journalist, sharper than the rest, broke through. "So what's changed, Mr. Montgomery?" For the first time, Richard's voice cracked. "I thought power came from owning everything. But tonight, my son showed me that real power is standing when the world expects you to fall. And I didn't learn that in a boardroom. I learned it in there, from people you've never cared to see." The silence that followed was different from the silence of luxury restaurants. This one carried weight. Truth had been spoken, unpolished and undeniable. And though Richard Montgomery could retreat, hide, or spin this into strategy, he knew one thing had shifted permanently. The fortress he had built around his life had been breached. Not by rivals, not by markets, but by a waitress who refused to bow, a son who refused to be fragile, and a community that refused invisibility. It was the moment when privilege collided with dignity and dignity refused to yield. The next weeks unfolded not as headlines, but as quiet revolutions. The press had their frenzy. Of course, articles debated whether Richard Montgomery's community appearance was philanthropy or publicity. Pundits argued, investors speculated, and critics dismissed it as a billionaire's indulgence. But inside the Bronx warehouse, the world moved differently. Lucas returned every Tuesday and Thursday. At first, he was cautious, relying on Diana's gentle guidance and the encouragement of the other children. But each session stripped away layers of fear, replacing them with laughter and pride. The braces that once felt like cages became instruments of rhythm. He learned to fall without shame, to rise without apology, and most importantly, to lead. Diana never treated him like a fragile heir. To her, he was simply another child with dreams stitched inside his steps. Her attention was equal whether directed at the girl mastering her wheelchair spin, the boy who tapped with his prosthetic leg, or Lucas, whose name now blended into the chorus of belonging. Richard observed from the edges at first, arms crossed, his mind still calculating, always calculating. But as the weeks passed, calculation gave way to humility. He began to trade his tailored suits for simple shirts, blending awkwardly into folding chairs at the back of the studio. He no longer hid his discomfort, it became a marker of change. For once in his life, he wasn't the man with all the answers. He was the student! Diana noticed the shift. She saw it in the way he no longer interrupted. In the way he clapped for children who weren't his own. In the way his gaze softened when Lucas stood without looking for his father's approval. And though she carried no illusions about the chasm between their worlds, she understood this. Even walls built from privilege can crack when confronted with truth. Months later, the warehouse pulsed with a different kind of energy. It was the annual showcase for Freedom Steps. Families filled the room, their applause echoing like thunder as children performed routines that defied expectation. The stage was modest, but the spirit was grand. Lucas was chosen to lead the final number. His braces glinted under the lights as he took his place at the center, surrounded by friends who cheered his name. The music began, drums rising into a crescendo, feet tapping, wheels spinning. Lucas moved, not flawlessly, but freely. Each step he took radiated defiance against pity, against silence, against the boundaries once imposed on him. When the number ended, the audience erupted. Richard, seated in the front row, rose to his feet with tears streaking his face. For the first time, he did not clap as a proud billionaire, nor even as a father desperate for control. He clapped as a man who had been broken and rebuilt by the simplest of truths. That dignity is not given by wealth that is lived, earned, and shared. After the performance, reporters again crowded, near, eager for statements. Richard could have announced donations, partnerships, or new ventures. But instead, he redirected every question. Don't ask me, he said firmly. Ask them. Ask Diana. Ask the children. Their voices matter more than mine. It was a moment that stunned those who had known him only as the architect of dominance. Investors whispered that he was softening. Critics accused him of theatrics. But within the community, the shift was undeniable. For once, the billionaire had chosen silence not as avoidance, but as deference. Diana, too, was transformed. For years, she had fought for recognition, exhausting herself against closed doors and polite refusal. She had carried the weight of invisibility with grace, but not without scars. Now, she saw her program not only survive, but thrive. New families joined. Resources flowed not through Richard's handouts, but through awareness that grew organically, sparked by truth rather than spectacle. One evening, as the children cleaned up after class, Diana lingered near the doorway. Richard approached, hesitant. For all his power, he seemed smaller here, humbled. You were right, he admitted quietly. It wasn't about buying help. It was about listening. And I never listened not to Lucas, not to her, not to anyone who didn't fit my world. Diana's reply was simple, but it carried the weight of years. Listening is where change begins. Their paths would never fully converge, hers rooted in community, his in empire. But both knew the collision had carved something permanent. Richard had discovered humanity in the place he least expected. Diana had seen validation bloom not from permission, but from persistence. And Lucas had found freedom not in perfection, but in the rhythm of resilience. The showcase ended, the applause faded, and life continued. Yet the impact rippled beyond those walls. Families who once hid their children's struggles now celebrated their strength. Wealthy patrons who once ignored Diana's letters now wrote checks, but more importantly, they showed up. And Richard, once defined by silence, began to use his platform not for self-preservation, but for amplification. Still, the most lasting change was quieter. It was in the mornings when Lucas walked into the kitchen, breasts clicking against tile, carrying not shame, but pride. It was in the evenings when Richard sat beside him, no longer dictating, but listening. And it was in the memory of a wife gone too soon, whose absence had carved silence, but whose love had left a seed waiting to grow. Because sometimes transformation does not roar. Sometimes it whispers in the spaces we least expect, in a warehouse with peeling paint, in the laughter of children once dismissed, in the courage of a waitress who chose to stand when silence was safer. And so, the story closes where it began, with a step. Not a grand gesture, not a billionaire's check, but a single step taken by a boy once deemed too fragile to lead. A step guided by a woman who refused invisibility. A step witnessed by a father who finally understood that wealth means nothing without humanity. A step that reminded everyone watching change begins when we choose to see those the world has ignored. And now, the question is left to us. When the moment comes to choose between silence and courage, which step will we take?